Leicester is a city with a tradition of hard work and making do. People are used to finding ways to make ends meet. But here and across the country, that's becoming more and more difficult. Figures today from the ONS show just how many Britons have been making cost of living cutbacks. Between March and June, 24 million adults, that's half of the adult population, used less gas and electricity. 19 million, that's 42%, started cutting back on non-essential journeys in their cars. And more than a third had to go even further. 16 million people have been cutting back on food and essential items. St Peter's Church in Leicester does hot dinners several days a week. It means people can save on the cost of buying and cooking a meal. Jennifer says she tries to make savings, but on a pension, you can't always afford to do a full shop.
Some people go to the food bank and some don't want to go because they're ashamed of it, thinking people is going to judge them, but nobody's going to judge them going to the food bank.
And have you had to do that?
Oh, I've been quite a few times. Let's put it that way. And share it with my friends as well.
Mahesh says he might not go hungry this winter, but he will have to ration the heating.
They say, choose between eating and heating, which is very true. It's going to be a choice. Do you put food on the plate or do you put the heating on?
Do you think that's a choice that you will have to make?
I think food-wise will be okay. And if we be careful with how much we use gas and electricity, we might be okay. But it's going to be a struggle.
Marva took on this job a few months ago when she couldn't afford her own bills. With a husband and 5 children at home, they're high.
£164 for my gas and £163 a month for my electric.
So over £300 a month?
Yeah, £327, yeah.
And can you find that kind of money?
Most months I struggle to find it, but yeah. It has been, just lately it has been a struggle because my children are still at home, even my grown-up children are still at home. And for them, it's cheaper for them to be at home because
they can't afford
to move out anymore. Yeah, I'm always telling my kids, stop charging their phones, like when they're on it, turning the lights off, and when it's really, really dark. Well, sometimes I don't even put the light on in the living room because, don't need it. And plus it's so expensive.
Tomorrow night, St Peter's will give out free hot meal parcels, something which started during COVID, but in the cost of living crisis is now a lifeline for around 80 families.
We're going to see a hard winter that in many ways for some areas will be far harder than COVID ever was. We all felt we were going through COVID together, and so there was a pulling together. This is very different. This is people going, we can't cope. So far anyway, there doesn't seem to be the rallying around from government to go, we will help you out, we'll bail you out in these situations.
We don't know who will be the Prime Minister during the coming recession, but candidate Rishi Sunak has had to explain a video from last week telling an audience in Kent he diverted funding away from areas just like Leicester when he was Chancellor.
Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, then that needed to be undone.
This is what he said today.
And people who need help and extra investment aren't just limited to big urban areas. You find them in towns across the United Kingdom and in rural areas too. And that was a point I was making, that our funding formulas that fail to recognise that are out of date and they needed changing.
Rishi Sunak says he'd remove VAT on energy bills. Liz Truss says she's the one to help struggling families.
That's why it's very important that we reverse the national insurance increase, that we have a temporary moratorium on the green energy levy to help people with their fuel bills. But the most important thing is getting the economy going so we avoid a recession.
The Bank of England says we should be prepared for a recession which will last until the end of 2023. This year and next could be some of the hardest millions of us have ever known.
Jane Deeth there. Well, tonight, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak are speaking to party members at a hustings in Eastbourne. Our political reporter, Serena Barker-Singh, is there for us now. Serena.
It's the fourth one of these hustings out of 12, so we're about a third of the way through. And the worry was always that these could become a little repetitive. That's not been the case. As you can see just behind me, a coalition of anti-conservative protesters have turned up, and they're actually mingling with some of the Conservative voters that are on their way inside the hustings to see Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak on stage. Now, Liz Truss has just taken to the stage, and when you speak to her team, they're relatively upbeat. They're doing quite well in terms of they think they've got the endorsements that they want. They're also doing well in the polls. But when you speak to Rishi Sunak's team, they're also quite upbeat. They think they've reached a turning point last night with the Sky debate, where they said they managed to sway lots of the undecided. And it feeds into their strategy of meeting as many members as they can. So they said they've been to 60 member events. They've met about 5,000 to 10,000 members. Remember, there's only 160,000 or so Conservative members who can vote in this election. So they're both relatively happy, but there are 8 of these hustings left to go, so there's plenty of time for things to change. And one of those things could be that leaked video that you saw earlier in Tunbridge Wells. Critics are saying that it exposes Rishi Sunak's political vulnerability, perhaps. Some saying that he's too wealthy to understand the ordinary voter. His team say you can't have a discussion about levelling up without talking about rural areas. But the fact that he was in Tunbridge Wells, people see as an affluent area, and the word deprived areas that he used, where the money would be coming from, is what critics are saying are the most damaging. Labour have seized on it, saying it's a bribe, a reminder that they're watching all of this, potentially using it for political ammunition later on.
Serena, thanks very much. Well, if Liz Truss does become the next Prime Minister, it's being reported that she will hold an emergency budget on September the 21st, barely 2 weeks into the job. That won't give her much time to dig through the government books to find enough money to fund her promised tax cuts and possibly give people extra help with soaring energy bills at the same time. Our economics reporter, Neil MacDonald, is here. Neil, what could Liz Truss do about energy bills?
Well, let's start with the problem that the next government is going to be facing. We talk all the time about the energy price cap. Let's have a look at the change we were expecting from October last year to October this year, an absolutely mammoth increase of £1,500. In response to this, the government, Rishi Sunak, had already committed £400 to every household, and then with the council tax rebate and universal credit, support of up to £1,200 available. The whole package costing about £25 billion. The problem, of course, is yesterday the Bank of England told us this increase is going to be £700 more than we were expecting. So if the next government wants to offer the same level of support to people as previously, there'd be another £175 for all households, and on top of that, £375 for those on universal credit. All told, another £8 billion of support.
What about reversing the national insurance hike?
So this is something, obviously, Liz Truss is very keen on, and it would put about £12 billion into people's pockets, which sounds rather close to that number. There are, however, some concerns about whether national insurance is really the right way to tackle this problem. The Institute for Fiscal Studies points out that if you're retired, if you're unemployed, if you earn less than £12,000 a year, you don't pay national insurance, and therefore cutting the rate puts no money in your pocket at all. And of course, those groups are likely to be particularly hard hit by rising energy bills. So there is a chance that Liz Truss is going to have to fund a support package as well as cutting national insurance.
And would it end there?
Well, there's another big problem that the government is going to be facing. All the support we're talking about is, of course, for this current year. Let me give you a very quick look at an early forecast for the price cap next April, £3,700, even higher. If we're prepared to give people support this year, then obviously there's just a strong case for giving them support next year. But if the level of that support is roughly the same, then the government's going to need to find about £33 billion to fund it.
Neil, thanks very much.
Well, Sir John Redwood is among 21 current and former cabinet ministers who signed a letter backing Liz Truss. I spoke to him earlier and began by asking him about the September emergency budget if she wins and what we could expect.
I think an emergency budget has to do quite a lot about that focus of the cost of living crisis. So Liz Truss has suggested suspending the green duties on power bills, which would be a good start. She's also suggested getting rid of the national insurance increase that Rishi imposed, which would give people in work a bit more money to pay those bills. And I think the new Prime Minister and the new Chancellor will have to do some very quick work early in September to see what else can be afforded. Fortunately, the third quarter of this year does see some payments going back direct to people under the original Rishi Sunak package, which is helpful. But I think we're going to need to do more to get us through this winter crisis. And I think the Chancellor and Prime Minister will have to do some hard work, both on spending priorities and on what is affordable, because we need to do a bit more to help people.
So when you talk about doing more, we're talking about more direct payments, are we? I mean, is that the mechanism? Because obviously prices are going to keep going up beyond what Rishi Sunak thought with his original package, and they're going to stay high through next year. It's not as if they're suddenly going to fall again.
Well, we don't know, do we? Let's hope we can work on various levels. And if we can increase supply of electricity and gas in the UK from domestic sources over time, that will help a bit. We need to ease the squeeze at the supply level. If we can help people with their incomes, as with the national insurance reduction, that will help. And yes, we need to look at those taxes that relate directly to the energy bills, because the more you can do to cut the taxes on energy itself, the more you're going to get relief both for people's budgets and on the inflation rate.
You're right, because obviously the green levies is just about £150. National insurance, yes, I mean, will put money in people's pockets, but only those people who are earning enough to be paying it, and that's not going to include the poorest people. So, I mean, we are looking, aren't we, at another package of measures that could cost tens of billions of pounds that's probably going to have to be announced in the autumn.
Well, I'm not sure it's going to cost tens of billions, but it could be expensive, yes. But you've got to bear in mind the first package, which is coming through now with the £400 up to £1,200 for people who've got particularly squeezed budgets. And we may need to add to that, as well as doing the tax reductions and the other measures that Liz has already set out. So I think that does need to be seen in the round with a proper affordable package. And I repeat that because nobody believes that you should just go on a huge borrowing binge on top of the ones we've already had for the COVID downturns and lockdown periods. There does need to be some work on the rest of public spending, not in any way to shortchange crucial frontline services.
So are you talking about a new round of austerity, effectively?
No, of course not. I'm anti-austerity. I believe we've got to go for growth, and that's what I like about Liz Truss's candidature. The way out of this is growth or a shallower recession compared with the pessimistic bank forecasts. I can assure Rishi that the way to get the deficit down is to limit the recession, preferably to have growth, because if we go into recession, we will have a massive increase in borrowing because there would be a very big increase in the deficit.
And so do you believe that there will be a year of recession? Or do you sort of how do we judge? When Liz Truss says this is avoidable, if she fails to avoid it, what are we supposed to think?
Well, why don't we get there first? I mean, surely you and I can agree that it's a worthy aim to try and head off the recession the Bank of England is now predicting. And you might agree with me that it still is only a prediction from a forecasting group that haven't had a great record in forecasting.
But they're not the only ones saying that.
So we need to do everything we can to stop it. Can I guarantee we can stop it? No, of course I can't guarantee that the UK under Liz Truss could stop it. But I do think Liz Truss will give it every good shot and take lots of good advice from those who wish to promote growth, increase supply, increase investment, keep jobs going, which is the way to keep the deficit down and to have a better future.
John Redwood, thank you very much.
Well, the North West Durham MP Richard Holden won his seat in the Tory landslide of 2019 and is now supporting Rishi Sunak. He's in central London and joins us now. Mr. Holden, your candidate Rishi Sunak boasting about diverting money away from deprived areas. As one of the MPs fighting for levelling up, it's a hard thing to have to come on and defend, isn't it?
Rishi was talking about the long-term issue that we're facing, which is that actually some urban parts, and that was the specific thing that he talked about, urban parts of the country, so the large cities like London, have been getting very significant capital funding over a very long period of time. Now, a few years ago, me and other members of the Northern Research Group really started campaigning to get what's known as the Green Book from the Treasury changed. The Green Book is basically the statistics and analysis behind how long-term government investment is allocated. Now, we were successful in getting that change from Rishi. Rishi has torn up the Treasury orthodoxy of 40 years.
And Rishi
ensured
Sunak
that
said
areas
today,
like
let's be clear and honest about what he said in this video. Labour shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas. That needed to be undone, he said, to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding they deserve. He was speaking in Tunbridge Wells. Do you know where Tunbridge Wells features in official figures on deprivation?
He also said exactly the same thing, Jackie, in my constituency of North West Durham just a few days before that. Strangely, nobody decided to put that on camera. But he said exactly the same thing. It's actually
He said
country
areas like this. Now, Tunbridge Wells is the least deprived area
Jackie, you
in
seem
Kent.
to be ignoring the point of what I've just said.
I'm taking up the point that Rishi Sunak said.
Jackie,
if you let me finish my point, then we can speak.
He said exactly the same thing in County Durham several days before. What he was saying is that some parts of the country, large metropolitan cities, have had huge amounts of transport investment. Just look at the Elizabeth line in central London at the moment. You know, £20 billion invested in that. Actually, areas of the country, from County Durham to Cornwall, from Hastings on the south coast to Hartlepool in the northeast, have not seen that capital investment over the last few decades. What they really need is that capital investment.
Okay.
And there are parts of Tunbridge Wells, there are parts of other parts of the country, Tewkesbury, which might not have that capital investment.
A very straightforward question then, Mr. Holden, a very straightforward question then. Would you be happy for money that's currently going to your constituency? Durham has 26% of children living in poverty. Would you be happy if some of that money now being diverted to Tunbridge Wells?
Is that what Rishi Sunak said, or are you asking me a totally theoretical question?
Well, I've
based
quoted
on
what he said today
bias?
to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding they deserve.
What he was talking about was stopping large urban areas which have had huge amounts of capital funding through the Green Book, Treasury orthodoxy for decades, which have actually seen huge improvements over the last 20 years.
Okay.
Huge improvements, not getting that capital funding going forward.
A fellow Northern MP and the chair of the Northern Research Group, sees it rather differently. He sees what Mr. Sunak says today as Mr. Sunak boasting about trying to funnel vital investment away from deprived areas.
Well, that's total nonsense from Jake Berry, and Jake Berry knows it because Jake Berry and I sat on the chair on the NRG Executive Committee together, along with people like Jacob Young, who's also highlighted this fact today. We campaigned for those Green Book changes in order that what happened in the past was if areas are doing well, like parts of cities which have grown over the last few years, central Manchester, central London, they've done very well over the last few years. And the Treasury orthodoxy said, if areas are doing well, you keep pumping more money into them. What Jake Berry, what Jacob Young, what people like me and others did was campaign for that to change. Because what we needed to see, the change we needed to see, and this is quite clear, was that if areas aren't doing well, then they need capital investment.
So
then they need
Jake Berry, a man who has been at the
forefront,
Jake Berry, a man who has been at the forefront of levelling up, is talking nonsense today, is he?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I look, I don't know why Jake said what he's said today. Jake Berry was in the House of Commons in 2021, exactly calling for these funding formula changes. In 2020 and earlier, he was on the front bench demanding these sorts of changes. So I don't know why he's done what he's done. He's come out recently for Liz Truss. That's up to him to defend his comments and why they're different from what he said not that long ago. I've been consistent. Just a second. I've been consistent in my views. Others have to defend their inconsistency in their views. What I want to see is funding coming to places like North West Durham, like to the seaside towns across the country, north and south, who have not seen that investment, and also other rural parts of the country who are not getting the investment they need.
Mr. Holden. If I may,
thank you.
We've had this today. Earlier in the week, we had Liz Truss with a regional pay policy, which most people were suggesting would make Northerners poorer. Are you starting to worry that this government actually doesn't care about levelling up?
Well, Rishi Sunak is not in the government at the moment, and the changes he put through were widely welcomed.
He's been
by
the
Jake Berry
Chancellor
and
for a number of years.
And others, yes, he was. And I've just said that Jake Berry and I and others welcomed those changes through the change to the Green Book about capital investment. What I am concerned about, though, is what you mentioned just before about Liz's proposal for London to have the same pay levels, but other parts of the country to have lower pay levels. I've seen that she seems to have decided to reverse that policy proposal, and I welcome that change in her stance on that.
Richard Holden, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you very much indeed.